During World War II, China was one of the Allied powers. Under Chiang Kai-shek, millions of Chinese nationalist soldiers fought against the Japanese. But after that war, they then fought the Chinese Civil War. And after Chiang's army lost that war to the Chinese Communists, things were turned on their heads. And now Mao Zedong's Chinese Communist soldiers are fighting in Korea against the Western armies. But what happened to the Nationalist Army? Did they all just disappear? Have they joined the Communists? Did Mao execute them all? Let's find out. I'm Indy Neidell. This is a Korean War in real-time special episode. Okay, those of you who watched our World War II in real-time series, which should be all of you, will know that China began fighting the Japanese already in 1937. And even while fighting the Japanese over the next 8 years, China was often crippled by internal conflicts and issues. For one big one, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government had increasing tension with the forces of Mao Zedong's Chinese Communists. During the war, the two sides had an uneasy truce, often, to concentrate on opposing the Japanese. In the months leading up to the Japanese surrender, tensions started to rise again, and the United States tried to broker some sort of compromise between the nationalists and the communists. This did not work out, and active fighting broke out between the two soon after the end of the Second World War. To cut a very, very long and complicated story very short, the Chinese communists are eventually victorious in the Civil War, and Chiang and his nationalist government flee to the island of Formosa, Taiwan, in December 1949. That long and complicated story is being covered in our War to War series on our Time Goes History channel, and you will not want to miss that. But in the Second World War, Chiang's army was strong in size. We know for sure that not all of these men later escaped to Taiwan. One of our viewers here sent in a comment asking, what did happen to all those men who were left behind in China after the Civil War? He wondered if they'd maybe been subjected to disproportionate recruitment or conscription into Mao's PLA, People's Liberation Army. In other words, are they being sent now to the front lines in Korea as cannon fodder? This inspired us to investigate the true fate of Chiang's Kuomintang, KMT, the Chinese Nationalist Army, the third largest Allied army in World War II, and what part they are playing, if any, in the Korean War. There are several fates that befell the Chinese nationalist soldiers after the Second World War and during the Civil War. First, there are those who switched sides before the start of the Civil War. The Nationalist Army was downsized after Japan's surrender in accordance with U.S. President Harry Truman's calls for peace and General Marshall's mediation efforts between the nationalists and the communists. They wanted Chiang to show a commitment towards a peaceful resolution instead of civil war. So Chiang just kind of discharged them without any further thought. Kinda. By this point, many soldiers weren't exactly keen on fighting for Chiang anyway. Nationalist China was not in great shape after the Japanese surrender. As we have discussed on innumerable occasions, it was, both fairly and unfairly, saddled with the blame for the struggles of the war years, and was pretty unpopular with a large percent of its population. The land seizure in southern China to construct air bases without compensating the impoverished farmers, the breaking of the Yangtze and Yellow River dikes and levees in an attempt to stall the Japanese advance, and the blatantly and irrefutably corrupt officer corps all contributed to this perception. While there are actually mitigating defenses for much of this in Chiang's favor, that doesn't help much. So there were hundreds of thousands of unemployed soldiers looking for a job and a battle to fight. And it just so happened that the communist forces were then increasing in both numbers and material, the latter especially after they seized a lot of the Japanese Kwantung Army supplies in Manchuria and northeast China at the end of World War II. If we assume that the average KMT soldier was at least vaguely aware of how unpopular the KMT was, how much internal conflict existed within the party, and the party's inability to effectively administer China, why would they not try their luck with the much more popular PLA? Also, during the Civil War, there are many cases of KMT prisoners of war switching sides and joining their communist captors. The CCP, Chinese Communist Party, famously had a great deal of success in convincing people to join them. Through indoctrination, usually, prisoners were either sentenced to rehabilitation or retribution. Either one could occur depending on what benefits the CCP thought they could extract from the offender. For example, why would you kill a common KMT soldier when they could indoctrinate that soldier in communist doctrine and send him home to assist in the education of his village? Counter-revolutionaries are trash. They are vermin. But once in your hands, you can make them perform some kind of service for the people. And this: the political work of the 8th Root Army is guided by 3 basic principles. Third, the principle of disintegrating the enemy troops and giving lenient treatment to prisoners of war. This was the lenient treatment policy for enemy prisoners of war, which heavily stressed the integration and re-education of captured KMT troops. In January 1949, all 25 divisions of General Fu Tsoi's Beijing garrison defected to Communist General Lin Biao when Fu grew disillusioned with Chiang Kai-shek. That's somewhere between 250 and 260,000 people. In total, as many as 1.7 million of the 4.5 million KMT soldiers who were captured from 1946 to 1950 were reported as having joined the People's Liberation Army. As for captured generals and officers, they generally faced much harsher consequences than the infantry, lengthy prison sentences and executions. But brownie points for denouncing the KMT certainly factored in to getting a better chance at survival. I want to briefly mention that here were also cases of former Japanese soldiers switching sides to one or other of the Chinese forces during the Civil War. Writing about this phenomenon, history Tessamore Suzuki writes that for the great majority of Japanese, joining the Chinese forces was not a matter of ideological commitment, but rather a question of survival or force majeure. There are also those who crossed the Taiwan Strait with their government. Chiang and most of his inner circle, along with hundreds of thousands of people and soldiers, escaped to Taiwan, carrying as much gold and cash as they could. By mid-April 1949, 300,000 nationalist troops had already relocated there. That is the equivalent of 2 D-days worth of men. It wasn't just men either. An average of 50 planes daily from August to December 1949 were needed just to move ammunition and fuel to Taiwan. This was a population relocation of truly monumental proportions, and although perfectly exact statistics and records do not exist, we know there was extensive settlement of KMT veterans around Taiwan because of nearly 800 servicemen villages scattered around the island. Obviously, the population of Taiwan ballooned from 1940 to 1950 in the census, indicating an influx of well over 1 million people. But the KMT army, as mentioned, numbered in the millions. We know about 1 million or so made it to Taiwan. The rest is an awful lot to account for. Officers and generals who were able to escape to Taiwan did, though several are known to have been sent back to the mainland to continue the struggle against the communists. These officers were ordered to launch insurgency and guerrilla campaigns. Many of them enlisted either desperate peasants or straight-up criminals to carry out that work for them. This meant much of this insurgency took the form of piracy and banditry. At sea, the nationalists were able to support this campaign because they still had the 26 ships of the Chinese Navy. This was smaller in number, but of superior quality to the People's Liberation Navy. They were even able to partially blockade mainland Chinese coast for decades, starting in June 1949. Yes, decades. While the Chinese Communist Navy was bolstered by Soviet aid, captured Japanese vessels, and defected KMT naval ships and troops, it would take until about the mid-1960s before it could be considered fully modern and combat effective. You see this during the communist attempt to take Kinmen Island in October 1949, literally right off the mainland coast, which ended in complete disaster for them. During the attack on nationalist-held Hainan Island last year in March 1950, the communists had to mount obsolete portable mountain guns on wooden junks to assist in the assault, though there they actually won. The most well-known and historically researched instance of the KMT's mainland insurgency campaign, which isn't saying much, was the Kuomintang Islamic insurgency. Forces led by former Ma clique generals, the Ma clique being one of the powerful warlord groups loyal to Chiang after the 1928 Northern Expedition, launched a rebellion last year in 1950 in most of western China, specifically modern Xinjiang and Yunnan. The end of that rebellion lies in the future, but I can somehow tell and the PLA will crush it, and some of its leaders will escape, some will be executed, and some will join the communist forces. A microcosm of this whole episode, I guess. In response to these KMT guerrilla campaigns, Mao Zedong launches the appropriately named Campaigns to Suppress Banditry and Campaigns to Suppress Counter-Revolutionaries. These campaigns result in hundreds of thousands, and by some estimates, well over 1 million of the roughly 2.5 million nationalist forces left in mainland China either being killed in combat or summarily executed. Mao will later officially claim more than 712,000 counter-revolutionaries have been killed, more than 1,290,000 have been imprisoned, and 1,200,000 have been placed under control. While there isn't a complete historical consensus, the discrepancies found in the official records indicate the 700,000 figure is likely far lower than the actual number of victims. To clarify, a counter-revolutionary isn't a concrete characterization. Anyone who went overtly against Mao's regime in either speech or action to the left or on the right, doesn't matter, could be labeled as such, along with those who physically took up arms against the state. There were also probably quite a lot of regular KMT soldiers who just blended back into society. It is certainly possible that many of those who did were eventually found out and caught up in one of Mao's later purges. Spoiler. But really, anyone could have been caught up in the purges. In fact, they were probably better off staying in the KMT army and then switching sides. Their service to the new government would have demonstrated their commitment to the revolution. So, going back to the original question, former KMT troops did end up in the PLA, but under Mao's lenient policy, they were considered reformed, and no different than regular PLA soldiers. Mao was also not stupid. A huge number of new veteran troops was far too valuable an asset to not take advantage of. You know what? Looking at the Korean War so far, this lenient policy has initially also been applied to many captured UN soldiers, but as we will soon likely see, to much more limited success. The genuinely horrid conditions of the Chinese POW camps may make collaboration and ideological adjustment and a chance at better living conditions more desirable, but the massive cultural differences mean a microscopic number of UN troops will end up being turned red. Much more along these lines will be covered in future. We're now at a point where we'll have to have specials more often to cover events and issues that we don't have time to cover in the regular episodes. But if you really want to know the details of the Chinese Civil War and the general struggle between the communist world and the Western world, then watch the War to War series on our Time Ghost History channel, which will come up right here. And for more specials and more series, join the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv, timeghost.tv, or patreon.com. See you next time.